They said Vietnam was a war against communism.
Today, the communists reach ruthlessly for domination over Southeast Asia and are trying to break our will to foil the attempt.
They said we were defending a free nation from foreign aggression.
We just cannot leave those who trusted us to the terror and repression and murder that would follow.
They said it was a test of American resolve.
If, when the chips are down, the world's most powerful nation acts like a pitiful, helpless giant, the forces of totalitarianism and anarchy will threaten free nations and free institutions throughout the world.
The Vietnam War was the longest military engagement in American history. The most distant.
You are a long, long way from Fort Riley now.
And among the most divisive. Americans remember the images, the anguish, and the ending.
These events, tragic as they are, portend neither the end of the world nor of America's leadership in the world.
But few know the whole story of America's long involvement in the place called Vietnam. Vietnam is a land of extremes, both mysterious and magical. It's a restless place whose people have been shaped by centuries of struggle and warfare. European explorers discovered the region in the 1600s. They came first to spread Christianity, then to trade, then to plunder, and finally to conquer. By the end of the 19th century, the three regions of Vietnam, Cochin China, Tonkin, and Annam, were joined with Cambodia and Laos to form French Indochina. The native peasants became slave labor as Vietnam's rice, rubber, and other resources fueled the expanding French Empire. But even under the iron fist of French rule, the Vietnamese remained defiantly independent.
We have had enormous difficulties in enforcing our authority. Rebel bands disturb the country everywhere, destroying everything, then disappear into nowhere.
The French eventually tamed the resistance, but according to one account from the period, it was only through acts of incredible brutality. While some Vietnamese continued to resist subjugation, many embraced the trappings of Western culture and held positions within the French administration. Others grew restless for an end to foreign occupation and fled the country. Among them, the future leader of communist Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh. Philosopher, poet, nationalist, revolutionary. Ho arrived in Paris around 1919 and became a leading voice among 100,000 Vietnamese expatriates. Inspired by American President Woodrow Wilson's pledge of self-determination for all nations, Ho Chi Minh brought his dreams of autonomy to the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, only to learn that Wilson's New World Order did not apply to Asia. Ho then turned to socialism before embracing communism. He established the Communist Party of Vietnam and traveled to Moscow, where he encountered Stalin and Trotsky, whose Bolshevik revolution had toppled the Russian monarchy. It was here, in the newly forged Soviet Union, that Ho Chi Minh glimpsed the power and influence that could liberate Vietnam. He would later write, "It was patriotism, not communism, that inspired me."
The French resistance has collapsed and the Maginot Line has been broken, destroying all French resistance. Paris is an open city.
At the outbreak of World War II, the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan seemed unstoppable. With the fall of France, Japan seized control of the French colonies in Indochina. For Ho Chi Minh, it was an opportunity to rekindle the fight for Vietnamese independence. He returned to Vietnam and formed a national liberation movement called the Viet Minh to oppose the Japanese occupation and fight for an end to French colonial rule. Within 4 years, Ho Chi Minh had built the Viet Minh into the most influential political group in Vietnam. During this time, Ho wrote repeatedly to U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt, appealing for diplomatic recognition. Roosevelt was openly critical of French imperialism and opposed a resumption of colonial rule. Ho felt sure he would gain the support of the American president. World War II ended in August 1945. With their empire in ruins, Japanese troops abandoned Vietnam, and the Viet Minh quickly assumed control of the country. Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam's independence and established a provisional government. For the first time in its modern history, Vietnam was free of foreign domination and united from north to south. Ho reached out for international support, but by this time President Roosevelt was dead, and American political objectives had shifted. The Soviets were enslaving the countries of Eastern and Central Europe, and containing the further spread of communism became the post-war obsession of the United States and its allies. While patriotism may have inspired Ho Chi Minh, in the eyes of America, he was just another communist, caught on the wrong side of the emerging Cold War. Vietnam's newly proclaimed independence was fleeting. France immediately reasserted its authority in the south of Vietnam and moved to reconquer the rest of the country. The 8-year conflict that followed is known as the First Indochina War. It began as a colonial war between the French Union and Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh guerrillas to determine who would rule Vietnam. But it soon turned into a Cold War crisis. The United States began to send money and arms to support the French, while Communist China and the Soviet Union sent arms to the Viet Minh. By 1953, the fighting had consumed nearly 400,000 French and Vietnamese lives, and France was searching desperately for a way out. In November 1953, 12,000 French paratroopers descended into the valley of Dien Bien Phu in northwest Vietnam. Their mission was to draw the Viet Minh into a final, decisive battle to win the war. French commanders considered their base to be untakeable. They assumed the Viet Minh had neither the men nor the munitions to mount an offensive. But they had both, and Dien Bien Phu would become the greatest military defeat in French history. Over 50,000 Viet Minh troops scaled the surrounding hills, many pulling massive artillery pieces behind them. When it came, the Viet Minh attack was overwhelming. The French airstrip and artillery positions were quickly destroyed. With no way in or out, the besieged garrison became, in the words of one soldier, hell in a very small place. Two months later, the French defense collapsed and the 10,000 remaining soldiers surrendered. Humiliated, France was forced to abandon North Vietnam and negotiate for peace. Ho Chi Minh was welcomed in Hanoi as a hero. His victory earned him widespread support throughout the country. In Geneva, Switzerland, world leaders gathered to discuss the problems of Indochina and work towards a peaceful settlement for Vietnam. The growing Cold War cast its shadow over the conference. Amid fears that continued fighting might draw the superpowers into the conflict, the Viet Minh were forced to concede what they had won on the battlefield.